June 1943. Dawn spread slowly across the Central Pacific, turning the ocean into a sheet of pale steel. Wind moves across the deck of an American aircraft carrier as engines cough to life one by one. Mechanics step back. Signal flags rise. The first fighter rolls forward, heavy, broad-winged, unfamiliar even to some of the men watching it depart. Far above the water, Japanese pilots climb toward the morning sun expecting another encounter like those they had mastered for nearly 2 years. Their aircraft are lighter. Faster in a turn. Proven in countless victories since 1941. Experience tells them the coming battle will follow familiar rules. But radar operators below already see the difference. Intercepts are cleaner. Formations tighter. The incoming fighters hold altitude with quiet confidence. When the two forces finally meet, something subtle happens first. Japanese cannon fire strikes an American fighter, and it does not fall. Within minutes, assumptions built over years begin to collapse in the open sky. What unfolded that week was not merely a new aircraft entering combat, but the moment an entire balance of power began to shift, a change shaped long before these pilots ever saw one another. The story of the Hellcat did not begin in 1943. It began in an era when the skies over the Pacific belonged almost entirely to Japan. On the morning of December 7, 1941, aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy demonstrated a form of warfare few nations fully understood. Carrier aviation, fast, mobile, and precise, struck Pearl Harbor with devastating coordination. Fighters escorted bombers across hundreds of miles of ocean, proving that naval air power could decide wars before battleships ever fired their guns. At the center of this dominance was doctrine shaped during the interwar years. Japanese planners believed victory at sea would come through elite skill rather than industrial scale. Their naval aviators were trained through an exceptionally demanding system. Only a small percentage completed the program, but those who did emerged among the most experienced pilots in the world. Their aircraft reflected the same philosophy. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero emphasized range and maneuverability above all else. Lightweight construction allowed extraordinary agility. In early encounters, Allied pilots discovered that turning against a Zero was often fatal. Japanese fighters could outclimb, outturn, and outfight nearly every opponent they met in 1941 and early 1942. Across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, victories followed rapidly: Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese carrier groups operated with confidence born from preparation and recent success. For many pilots, combat became confirmation of long-held beliefs: superior training and courage could overcome numerical disadvantage. Meanwhile, the United States Navy faced a harsher reality. American fighters at the beginning of the war were designed under different assumptions. The United States Navy had emphasized ruggedness and carrier operability, but early aircraft struggled against the Zero's agility. Pilots learned painful lessons during the opening months of the war. Reports described enemy fighters appearing suddenly, turning impossibly tight circles, and striking before American formations could react. Survival required adaptation. Naval aviators began developing new tactics rather than competing directly with Japanese strengths. The thatch weave, a coordinated defensive maneuver, allowed American fighters to protect one another through teamwork instead of individual maneuvering. It marked an early realization: modern air combat was becoming cooperative rather than heroic. The first turning shock arrived during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. For the first time in history, opposing fleets fought without ships ever seeing one another. Aircraft became the primary weapons. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the battle revealed something critical: carrier warfare would be decided by detection, coordination, and replacement capacity as much as pilot skill. 1 month later came Midway. There, Japanese carrier aviation suffered catastrophic losses, including experienced pilots whose training required years to replace. The defeat did not immediately end Japanese air superiority, but it planted a hidden weakness. Japan's elite pilot corps had been designed for quality, not rapid regeneration. Every loss now mattered. Through late 1942, battles around Guadalcanal turned the skies into arenas of exhaustion. Japanese aviators often flew extreme distances from distant bases, arriving tired before combat even began. American pilots, operating closer to logistical support, slowly improved coordination between ships, radar stations, and fighter control officers. The war was changing shape. American engineers analyzed captured aircraft and combat reports. They discovered the Zero's strengths were inseparable from its vulnerabilities. Minimal armor, unprotected fuel tanks, and structural fragility under sustained damage. A single burst could ignite the aircraft if placed correctly. These discoveries reshaped American thinking. The question was no longer how to match Japanese fighters in agility. The question became how to survive long enough to win. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered a transitional phase. Japan still possessed skilled pilots and formidable carriers, but attrition quietly eroded its advantage. The United States, protected by vast industrial capacity, began preparing something fundamentally different, an aircraft designed not just to fight well, but to fight repeatedly, absorb punishment, and return its pilot home. Engineers, tacticians, and naval planners were moving toward the same conclusion, even if pilots in the sky had not yet realized it. The next stage of the war would not be decided by who turned tighter circles in the air, but by whose system could endure the longest. And that realization was already taking form inside American factories and design rooms, where a new fighter was being shaped specifically for the war the Pacific had become. By 1942, American naval commanders understood a difficult truth. Early victories in the Pacific had belonged to preparation, not inevitability. Japan had entered the war with experienced pilots, refined doctrine, and aircraft built around offensive reach. The United States would not reverse that advantage through minor improvements. It required reinvention. Combat reports flowed steadily back across the Pacific to Washington and to aircraft designers. Pilots described what worked, what failed, and what kept them alive. Engineers studied wreckage, intelligence assessments, and performance comparisons. Every lesson pointed toward the same conclusion: survivability and coordination mattered more than pure maneuverability. Inside the factories of Grumman, designers had already begun work on a successor to earlier naval fighters even before the war reached its most critical phase. The company held a reputation among naval aviators for building aircraft that could withstand punishment. Pilots jokingly called Grumman planes ironworks, machines that brought crews home despite damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. The new fighter would push that philosophy further. Engineers enlarged the airframe to house a more powerful engine capable of sustaining speed at altitude. Armor plating protected the pilot, an uncommon luxury compared to Japanese fighters. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fire. Wide landing gear improved carrier landings, lowering accident rates among inexperienced aviators arriving from rapidly expanded training programs. The aircraft that emerged became the F6F Hellcat. Its appearance alone signaled a shift in thinking. It was heavier, broader, and less delicate than the aircraft it would face. On paper, it did not outturn the Zero. That was intentional. Designers prioritized climb rate, dive speed, firepower, and durability, qualities aligned with evolving American tactics. 6.50 caliber machine guns provided sustained destructive power. Pilots were trained to attack using energy advantage rather than turning contests. Dive, strike, disengage, and climb again. The aircraft's strength allowed aggressive maneuvers without fear of structural failure. But the Hellcat was only part of a larger transformation. The United States Navy simultaneously restructured pilot training. Before the war, naval aviation produced small numbers of highly polished aviators. Now it needed thousands. Training pipelines expanded dramatically, emphasizing standardized procedures, formation discipline, and teamwork with radar controllers aboard ships. New pilots might lack years of combat experience, but they entered battle supported by systems older Japanese doctrine did not fully possess. Radar became central to this change. Carrier task forces deployed fighter direction officers who interpreted radar screens and guided intercepting aircraft toward incoming enemies long before visual contact. Pilots received vectors, altitude information, and positioning instructions, reducing surprise and allowing coordinated attacks. Air combat began shifting from individual encounters toward controlled engagements managed from ships below. Industrial production reinforced these advantages. American factories produced aircraft at a pace unmatched anywhere in the world. Replacement planes and pilots arrived continuously. Damaged aircraft were repaired or replaced quickly. Losses, while still tragic, no longer threatened operational collapse. Japan faced the opposite reality. Its training system struggled to replace veteran pilots lost in earlier battles. Fuel shortages limited flight hours for trainees. New aircraft designs appeared, but industrial limitations slowed production and refinement. The philosophy that had created early superiority now restricted adaptation. By mid-1943, two opposing systems were preparing to meet. On one side stood pilots shaped by pre-war excellence, flying agile machines designed for precision and individual mastery. On the other stood a growing force built around resilience, coordination, and overwhelming logistical support. Embodied in a new fighter entering operational service across American carriers. Few pilots understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. To them, it would appear as simply another engagement over endless ocean. Yet beneath the surface, years of learning, loss, engineering, and industrial mobilization had quietly rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. And when these systems finally collided in combat, the results would reveal not just which aircraft was superior, but which vision of modern war would define the future of the Pacific skies. By the summer of 1943, the meeting between Japanese pilots and the Hellcat was no longer just an encounter between aircraft. It was the collision of philosophies shaped by culture, technology, and survival. To understand why air superiority shifted so quickly, the moment must be viewed through several overlapping angles, each revealing a different layer of the transformation unfolding above the Pacific. Japanese naval aviators entered the war as some of the most experienced pilots on Earth. Many had trained for years before seeing combat, mastering formation flying, navigation over open ocean, and aerial maneuvering under strict discipline. Early victories reinforced confidence in both skill and doctrine. Combat was viewed as a test of individual mastery. But by 1943, the human landscape had changed. Losses at Midway and during the Guadalcanal campaign removed many veterans who had carried institutional knowledge. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer flight hours and less combat preparation. Training programs shortened under wartime pressure, and fuel shortages limited practice time. Experience, once Japan's greatest advantage, began quietly fading. American pilots followed a different path. Many were young, newly trained, and initially less experienced than their opponents. Yet they entered combat supported by structured procedures and standardized tactics. Survival was emphasized as much as victory. Pilots were taught when to disengage, how to cooperate, and how to rely on their wingmen rather than individual skill alone. The psychological difference became visible in combat reports. American pilots described confidence in their aircraft's ability to absorb damage. Japanese pilots increasingly faced opponents who refused to fight on familiar terms. The sky was becoming less personal, and more procedural. The aircraft themselves embodied opposing ideas about warfare. Japanese fighter design prioritized agility, range, and offensive capability. Weight reduction allowed extraordinary maneuverability but came at the cost of protection. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks were minimized to preserve performance. Early in the war, this trade-off proved effective against opponents unprepared for such agility. The Hellcat represented the opposite conclusion. Its designers accepted increased weight to protect the pilot and maintain combat effectiveness after sustaining hits. The powerful engine allowed high-speed dives and rapid recovery, enabling pilots to control when engagements began and ended. Instead of entering turning duels, Hellcat pilots attacked from altitude, fired concentrated bursts, and disengaged safely. Technology began dictating tactics rather than merely supporting them. Japanese pilots who expected opponents to turn with them instead faced fighters that climbed away or dove beyond pursuit. Combat geometry changed. Encounters lasted longer. Damage accumulated differently. The durability of American aircraft altered expectations in ways difficult to counter quickly. The battle was no longer decided in seconds of maneuvering, but in sustained control of energy and positioning. Behind every aircraft stood an invisible network. American naval aviation increasingly operated as an integrated system linking carriers, radar operators, fighter direction officers, maintenance crews, and pilots. Radar detection provided early warning. Controllers guided interceptors into optimal positions. Pilots entered combat already informed about altitude, direction, and enemy strength. Japanese aviation relied more heavily on visual detection and pilot initiative. While effective earlier in the war, this system depended on experience and situational awareness that became harder to maintain as losses mounted and engagements grew larger. The difference appeared subtle at first. American fighters arrived higher and better positioned. Interceptions occurred sooner. Formations maintained cohesion even after initial contact. Combat reports revealed a recurring pattern: Japanese pilots often encountered organized resistance rather than isolated targets. War in the air was becoming coordinated mathematics rather than instinctive artistry. And as these human, technological, and systemic forces aligned, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal their combined effect, a week of combat that transformed assumptions on both sides and hinted that the balance of power in the Pacific was already beginning to tilt. As encounters between Japanese pilots and the Hellcat multiplied, deeper forces began revealing themselves. The change unfolding in the Pacific was not caused by a single aircraft or battle. It emerged from interconnected advantages that reshaped how war functioned in the modern age. Viewed from additional angles, the rapid shift in air superiority becomes clearer, and far more inevitable. Air combat in the early Pacific War had often been chaotic. Fighters searched vast skies visually, engagements forming suddenly and dissolving just as quickly. By 1943, American carrier groups were turning combat into a controlled process. Radar pickets extended detection ranges far beyond human sight. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers tracked incoming formations and assigned interception courses. Hellcat pilots launched already knowing where to climb, where the enemy approached, and how to position themselves for advantage. Altitude became a weapon. Instead of reacting defensively, American fighters frequently arrived above Japanese formations. From this position, Hellcat pilots executed diving attacks that maximized speed and firepower while minimizing exposure. After firing, they climbed away under engine power Japanese aircraft struggled to match in sustained ascent. Japanese pilots noticed the difference immediately. Engagements felt increasingly one-sided in positioning rather than maneuvering skill. Encounters began with Americans holding initiative, a subtle but decisive shift. The sky itself was being organized. Perhaps the most decisive angle never appeared in combat reports at all. Behind every Hellcat stood American industrial capacity operating at unprecedented scale. Factories produced aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. Replacement engines, spare parts, ammunition, and trained crews flowed steadily across the Pacific. Damage no longer meant permanent loss. A Hellcat riddled with bullet holes might land safely, undergo repair, and return to combat days later. Pilots survived encounters that would previously have ended careers or lives. Experience accumulated rather than disappearing. Japan faced the opposite trajectory. Industrial limitations slowed aircraft production and complicated maintenance. Replacement pilots arrived faster than experience could be taught. Aircraft lost in combat often represented permanent reductions in operational strength. Over time, even small unfavorable loss ratios created irreversible consequences. War became arithmetic. Each engagement quietly widened the gap between forces capable of regeneration and those slowly exhausting irreplaceable resources. The most immediate transformation occurred inside cockpits. For Japanese pilots, early encounters with the Hellcat introduced uncertainty. Reports described American fighters absorbing hits and continuing to fight. Maneuvers that previously forced opponents into disadvantage now failed to produce decisive results. Confidence, once reinforced by consistent victory, began to erode. American pilots experienced the opposite effect. The Hellcat inspired trust. Pilots learned they could dive aggressively, survive damage, and return safely to their carriers. Confidence encouraged disciplined tactics rather than desperate maneuvering. Engagements became methodical instead of reactive. Morale shaped outcomes long before battles concluded. As word spread through squadrons, expectations changed. American aviators increasingly entered combat anticipating success. Japanese pilots faced growing unpredictability, unsure whether familiar tactics would still deliver victory. Psychology followed technology. Within weeks, combat narratives on both sides shifted tone. Encounters once described as evenly matched began showing consistent American advantage. The change appeared sudden to those flying missions, yet it had been building for years through training reforms, engineering decisions, and industrial momentum. All these angles, human, technological, tactical, industrial, and psychological, now aligned at the same moment in history. And when they converged during a concentrated series of operations in 1943, the results revealed themselves with startling clarity. In a matter of days, statistics, pilot testimonies, and battlefield outcomes pointed toward a new reality. The decisive phase was about to begin. A week of combat that would demonstrate, beyond debate, that control of the Pacific sky had begun to change hands. Late August 1943. The Pacific Ocean stretched quiet beneath scattered clouds as American carrier task forces advanced deeper into contested waters. Operations around the Solomon Islands had already hardened both sides through months of relentless combat. Yet something new now waited above the carriers, squadrons increasingly equipped with the F6F Hellcat. For many pilots, these missions felt routine at first. Flight decks vibrated as engines roared to full power. One after another, Hellcats accelerated down carrier decks and lifted into humid air, climbing steadily under guidance from radar controllers below. Reports soon arrived, incoming Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest, altitude estimated, formation size expanding. Unlike earlier stages of the war, American fighters did not search blindly. Vectors came calmly over the radio. Pilots adjusted headings with precision, climbing toward an interception point calculated minutes earlier by fighter direction teams. The engagement was already being shaped long before enemy aircraft became visible. Then silhouettes appeared against the sun, Japanese fighters escorting bombers, confident in tactics that had worked repeatedly since 1941. The first passes changed expectations almost immediately. Hellcats attacked from above in coordinated dives, their heavier frames accelerating rapidly. 6 machine guns opened sustained streams of fire that reached farther than many opponents anticipated. Japanese pilots responded instinctively, turning sharply to force maneuvering combat. Some American pilots followed briefly, but training quickly reasserted itself. They climbed away instead, regaining altitude and attacking again. The rhythm felt unfamiliar. Japanese pilots discovered their opponents refused prolonged turning contests. Every engagement reset vertically. American fighters struck, disengaged, and returned with renewed energy advantage. Attempts to pursue often failed as Hellcats dove beyond safe structural limits for lighter aircraft. Damage reports began telling a new story. American aircraft returned to carriers bearing bullet holes across wings and fuselage panels. Maintenance crews counted impacts that would previously have destroyed fighters outright. Pilots climbed from cockpits shaken but alive, reporting encounters survived rather than narrowly escaped. Meanwhile, Japanese losses accumulated faster than expected. Radar coordination allowed successive interception waves. Enemy formations encountered resistance repeatedly before reaching targets. Bombing accuracy declined under constant pressure. Escort fighters were forced into defensive reactions rather than offensive control. Within days, operational statistics began shifting. Commanders noticed increasing survival rates among American squadrons alongside rising Japanese aircraft losses. Individual dogfights still depended on skill, but overall engagements increasingly favored American formations. The Hellcat's reliability allowed longer patrols, broader coverage, and faster recovery between missions. For Japanese aviators, the psychological shock deepened. Opponents who once appeared vulnerable now absorbed punishment and returned repeatedly. Familiar tactics produced diminishing results. Combat reports described American fighters that climbed strongly, dove faster, and appeared in coordinated numbers guided by unseen direction. The sky no longer behaved as it had during earlier campaigns. Carrier commanders recognized the implications quickly. With improved fighter protection, strike aircraft operated with greater freedom. Task forces maneuvered more aggressively, confident their air cover could intercept threats before attacks formed. The transformation did not occur in a single battle headline. It unfolded across consecutive days, patrol after patrol, interception after interception, until patterns became undeniable. Air superiority was no longer contested moment by moment. It was beginning to stabilize. And as this realization spread through command centers on both sides, operations intensified. Japanese forces prepared larger responses, determined to reassert control, while American carriers pushed forward to test their growing advantage. The next phase would bring larger formations, heavier resistance, and proof that the change witnessed during this single week was not temporary, but the beginning of a permanent shift in the Pacific War. As the week of intensified combat continued, the change unfolding in the Pacific skies became impossible to ignore. What had first appeared as isolated successes now revealed a consistent operational pattern. Engagement after engagement produced similar results, and commanders on both sides began interpreting the same conclusion from very different perspectives. American carrier groups expanded their patrol zones. Hellcat squadrons launched earlier and flew farther, guided continuously by radar updates. Fighter direction officers tracked incoming aircraft with increasing confidence, refining interception geometry with each encounter. Instead of reacting defensively to Japanese strikes, American forces increasingly shaped when and where combat occurred. The initiative had shifted. Japanese formations approaching American fleets encountered layered resistance. First came distant interceptions high above the ocean. Then secondary fighter groups engaged surviving aircraft before they could organize attacks. By the time bombers reached target range, formations were often fragmented, escorts depleted, and coordination disrupted. Operational reports began noting declining effectiveness in Japanese strike missions. Bomb release patterns scattered. Escort fighters remained occupied defending against repeated Hellcat attacks rather than protecting bombers. Pilots described enemy fighters appearing repeatedly from above, breaking contact before counterattack could develop, then returning moments later from a new direction. The Hellcat's endurance made this possible. Its powerful engine allowed sustained climbs that restored altitude advantage quickly. Structural strength enabled aggressive dives without fear of catastrophic failure. Pilots could dictate engagement tempo, a decisive advantage rarely enjoyed earlier in the war. Loss ratios told the clearest story. While exact numbers varied by engagement, American squadrons increasingly reported destroying multiple enemy aircraft for every loss sustained. Maintenance logs confirmed high survivability rates among returning Hellcats. Aircraft that would once have been written off were repaired and returned to service, preserving both machines and experienced pilots. Japanese commanders recognized the danger. Naval aviation doctrine depended on highly trained aircrews capable of executing coordinated carrier strikes. Each lost pilot represented years of investment. Replacement training programs, already strained by fuel shortages and accelerated schedules, could not reproduce equivalent experience quickly enough. The consequences compounded rapidly. Veteran leaders disappeared from formations. Newer pilots flew alongside shrinking numbers of experienced instructors. Tactical cohesion weakened subtly but steadily. Engagements grew shorter as formations broke apart under sustained interception pressure. American intelligence officers analyzing combat results began reaching cautious conclusions. The combination of radar control, improved pilot training, and the Hellcat's design advantages had altered engagement dynamics across entire operations, not merely isolated dogfights. Air superiority was becoming systemic. Carrier commanders adjusted strategy accordingly. Strike missions expanded deeper into contested territory. Reconnaissance flights operated with reduced escort requirements. Naval planners increasingly assumed American fighters could maintain defensive control of fleet airspace. For Japanese aviators, the realization came more personally. Pilots returning from missions reported opponents who absorbed damage and reappeared days later. Encounters felt less predictable. Confidence built during early war victories faded as survival itself became uncertain. Some veterans adapted tactically, avoiding prolonged engagement. Others found traditional maneuvering insufficient against opponents controlling altitude and speed. The transformation unfolded quietly but decisively. Within a single operational week, cumulative evidence demonstrated that the balance of aerial power, once firmly held by Japan, had begun shifting toward the United States. The Hellcat did not achieve this alone. It served as the visible expression of deeper changes in training, technology, and industrial capacity. Yet in the cockpit, the effect felt immediate. Pilots sensed it in the way engagements began, in the number of aircraft returning safely, and in the growing expectation that American fighters would dominate encounters rather than merely survive them. By the end of that week, American commanders understood something profound. Future operations could now be planned under the assumption of increasing control of the sky. And once control of the air began to solidify, the entire strategic direction of the Pacific War started to change. Reshaping invasions, naval movements, and the fate of fleets still preparing for battles yet to come. The consequences of this shift would soon spread far beyond individual engagements, altering the momentum of the war itself. The change in air superiority did not announce itself with a single declaration. It revealed its consequences gradually, first in operational decisions, then in strategy, and finally in the expanding confidence of an advancing navy. In the weeks following the Hellcat's successful combat introduction, American carrier commanders began operating differently. Patrol schedules widened. Fighter screens extended farther from the fleet. Reconnaissance aircraft ventured deeper into contested airspace with reduced escort requirements. These adjustments reflected a growing belief that American fighters could now intercept threats before they reached striking distance. Control of the air translated directly into freedom of movement at sea. Carrier task forces maneuvered more aggressively through the Central and Southern Pacific. Naval planners increasingly relied on aviation to neutralize enemy resistance ahead of amphibious operations. Where earlier campaigns required cautious advances under constant threat of air attack, commanders now planned offensives assuming reliable fighter protection overhead. Strike missions multiplied. Dive bombers and torpedo aircraft launched with stronger confidence that escorting Hellcats could suppress enemy interception. Bombing accuracy improved as formations maintained cohesion longer. Losses among American strike aircraft began to decline relative to earlier campaigns, reinforcing the perception that the balance had shifted permanently. Maintenance crews noticed another critical change: pilots were returning. Aircraft arrived damaged but intact. Bullet holes marked wings and fuselage panels, yet armored cockpits and self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic loss. Experienced aviators accumulated missions instead of disappearing after their first encounters. Squadrons retained institutional memory, tactics refined through repetition rather than relearned by replacements. Experience began compounding in America's favor. For Japan, the consequences unfolded more harshly. Japanese naval aviation depended on elite aircrews trained through long pre-war programs. The accelerating loss rate among these pilots created gaps impossible to fill quickly. Replacement aviators entered combat with fewer flight hours and limited operational training. Formation discipline weakened, and coordination during complex carrier strikes became increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages worsened the problem. Training flights were reduced, limiting opportunities for new pilots to practice advanced maneuvers or large-scale coordination. Aircraft availability declined as maintenance resources strained under wartime pressure. The result appeared first in mission outcomes. Japanese strike groups increasingly struggled to penetrate American fighter defenses. Bombers arrived scattered or failed to locate targets altogether. Escort fighters found themselves reacting defensively against Hellcat interceptions rather than controlling engagement tempo. Psychological strain followed operational losses. Pilots accustomed to earlier success now faced repeated resistance. Combat reports reflected uncertainty, descriptions of American fighters arriving unexpectedly, surviving heavy fire, and maintaining formation discipline under pressure. Confidence, once a defining strength of Japanese naval aviation, began eroding. Meanwhile, American forces expanded their operational reach across the Pacific. Air superiority allowed reconnaissance mapping of future invasion targets. Naval gunfire and airstrikes softened island defenses before landings. Carrier aviation evolved from defensive necessity into offensive spearhead, shaping campaigns before ground troops ever arrived. Strategically, the implications were profound. The Pacific War depended on distance, thousands of miles of ocean separating objectives. Control of the air determined which fleet could approach safely, which islands could be reinforced, and which supply lines remained viable. As Hellcat-equipped squadrons established consistent dominance in contested zones, Japanese forces found it increasingly difficult to contest American advances. The shift created momentum. Operations that once seemed risky became achievable. Commanders planned further offensives with growing certainty that American aircraft would hold the skies long enough to secure victory. Each successful mission reinforced the next, accelerating a cycle of advantage. Yet the full impact of this transformation had not yet been fully measured. The immediate operational successes represented only the beginning. Larger battles still lay ahead, and the long-term consequences for Japanese naval aviation, and for the direction of the entire Pacific War, were still unfolding. What began as a single week of changing combat outcomes was now reshaping the strategic future of two nations locked in total war. By late 1943 and into 1944, the consequences of the Hellcat's arrival extended far beyond individual engagements. What had begun as a sudden shift in combat outcomes matured into a structural transformation of the Pacific War itself. Air superiority was no longer contested evenly, it increasingly favored American forces across entire regions of operation. American naval strategy evolved rapidly to exploit this advantage. Carrier task forces moved closer to heavily defended Japanese positions, launching sustained strikes against airfields, shipping lanes, and supply networks. Hellcat squadrons performed multiple roles: interception, escort, ground attack, and fleet defense, creating a flexible shield that allowed offensive operations to continue with reduced interruption. The effects became unmistakable during major campaigns that followed. As American forces advanced toward the Mariana Islands in 1944, Japanese commanders attempted to restore balance through a decisive carrier counteroffensive. They assembled one of the largest remaining concentrations of naval aviation, hoping experience and numbers could reverse the growing American advantage. Instead, the engagement revealed how deeply the balance had changed. American radar detected incoming formations long before visual contact. Hellcat squadrons launched in waves, guided precisely into interception positions. Pilots attacked from altitude, disengaged safely, and returned repeatedly to engage new targets. Japanese formations, already strained by inexperienced replacements and reduced coordination, suffered devastating losses. The battle later earned the informal nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, reflecting the overwhelming disparity in results. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed while American losses remained comparatively limited. The event confirmed what earlier weeks of combat had already suggested: Japanese carrier aviation could no longer contest sustained air superiority against modern American naval air power. Statistics reinforced the reality. By war's end, the F6F Hellcat would account for thousands of aerial victories in the Pacific theater, achieving one of the highest success ratios of any fighter aircraft of the conflict. While individual engagements varied, the broader trend remained consistent. American pilots increasingly entered combat with technological, tactical, and systemic advantages working together. For Japan, the consequences proved irreversible. Losses among trained aviators reached levels from which recovery became impossible. Training programs shortened further, producing pilots sent into combat with minimal preparation. Aircraft production struggled under resource shortages and strategic bombing. Without experienced crews to operate them effectively, even new aircraft designs could not restore earlier effectiveness. Naval aviation, once the spearhead of Japanese expansion, gradually transformed into a defensive force attempting to slow inevitable advance. American momentum accelerated. Air superiority enabled amphibious invasions across the Central Pacific, allowing forces to bypass heavily defended positions and strike strategic objectives directly. Carrier aircraft neutralized enemy airfields before landings began, reducing casualties and compressing campaign timelines. Control of the sky reshaped naval warfare into a sequence of coordinated air-led offensives. The psychological dimension extended beyond pilots. Sailors aboard American ships increasingly trusted their fighter cover. Ground forces landing on contested islands expected air support overhead. Commanders planned operations assuming enemy air resistance would be limited and temporary. By contrast, Japanese planners faced shrinking options. Without reliable air cover, fleets risked destruction before reaching engagement range. Supply routes became vulnerable. Strategic initiative passed steadily to the United States. Historians later identified this period as one of the decisive transitions of the Pacific War, the moment when industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and tactical evolution combined to produce enduring air dominance. The Hellcat symbolized that transformation, but its true significance lay in what it represented: the emergence of integrated warfare where aircraft, radar, logistics, and training functioned as a single system. From that point forward, battles in the Pacific increasingly unfolded under American control of the air, a condition that shaped every campaign leading toward Japan itself. And as the war moved closer to its final stages, the meaning of this transformation extended beyond victory or defeat, raising deeper questions about how modern wars would be fought in the age of machines, industry, and coordinated power. The week that Japanese pilots first met the Hellcat was brief, but its consequences stretched far beyond the hours of combat. It was not a single dogfight or a solitary hero that reshaped the Pacific. It was the convergence of design, training, industrial might, and tactical innovation, a system working in unison to protect, endure, and strike with precision. The human element remained central. Pilots braved the vast ocean with skill and courage, yet their outcomes were increasingly dictated by factors outside their immediate control: armor plating, radar guidance, coordinated formations, and replacement cycles. Individual mastery alone no longer determined victory. Technology and industry had become weapons as decisive as any cannon. The Hellcat's robustness allowed tactics to evolve, the factory's output sustained operations. Radar directed strikes before enemies could even see them. Together, these factors revealed a new reality: modern warfare favors systems over singular brilliance. For the Japanese, the lesson was stark. Even elite pilots could not overcome attrition, industrial limits, and technological disadvantage. For the Americans, victory came through preparation, adaptation, and trust in collective effort. In those skies over the Pacific, history witnessed more than the fall of an enemy's air dominance. It witnessed the birth of a new kind of war, where mastery was measured not by who turned fastest, but by who endured, adapted, and controlled the system. And as the sun set over the endless ocean, the echoes of that transformation lingered, a quiet testament to how 1 week, 1 aircraft, and 1 vision of warfare could alter the course of history forever.